Good evening, guys. This is your Chapter 29 lecture. We'll be doing a review session on Sunday, so we'll be able to answer any questions you guys have. But where we left off today was taking a look at progressivism. You guys are now involved in a World War I simulation to get a feel for what's going on with the causes of World War I and American intervention in that. For us, though, when we take a look at the foreign policy for Woodrow Wilson, remember what we talked about previously when we were working our way through imperialism. Woodrow Wilson is considered an imperialist. And he is somebody who initially, kind of like you saw with New Nationalism and New Freedom, he is initially going to be he's going to be somebody who has idealistic visions. So, like when he became president, he had his New Freedom idea of getting rid of all monopolies, and they realized that that wouldn't work out very well in practice. He reformed that towards Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism. He's the same way with his foreign policy, where his philosophy is going to be to go move away from the big stick and dollar diplomacies. And he is going to find himself trying to embrace something called moral diplomacy instead. With his moral diplomacy, though, he is going to find himself having to deal with foreign policy, whether it's the Panama Canal Tolls Act of 1912 or the Jones Act. He finds himself dealing with the legacy of imperialism after these policies have been put into place. With things like the Jones Act is going to be promising that the Philippines will become independent. But that's only once they can establish what he considers a stable government. And in his mind, that's not going to happen for a very long time. And we're going to see that eventually the Philippines will only gain their independence after World War II is done, when they've been conquered by the Japanese and then recaptured by the United States. For Woodrow Wilson, though, his issues are going to be happening in Latin America. So we've already heard in the news recently about the president's controversial comments about Haiti and other sorts of places. We're going to find that in Haiti, they've got a very tumultuous relationship going on with the United States, because they have been used in a tug of war between European countries to see who can use them economically and militarily. For the United States, they will send the Marines into Haiti not to protect the Haitians, but instead they're going to be going in to protect American lives, American property. They're going to turn Haiti into a protectorate. And largely, they're going to be taking advantage of them economically so that they can be used as another piece of our imperialistic acquisitions. We're also going to see that for the United States, they are intervening in the Dominican Republic, they're moving into the Virgin Islands, and they're very much worried about trying to protect their access to the Panama Canal, because they feel like it's so vital to their navy to be able to have one gigantic navy rather than two ocean navies. For Woodrow Wilson, though, his biggest issue prior to World War I is going to be the Mexican Revolution. And what I would like you to do is make sure you connect this with World War I, because Mexico has had a lot of problems since their revolution. So when they had their revolution in the early 1800s, they then had the Mexican-American War, which was disruptive. You learn about Maximilian, the French leader who took over control of Mexico for a period of time. And so they have been finding themselves in a tug of war between European and American interests, and now they've got a leader who is going to be assassinated by General Huerta, and once that happens, it causes a ton of tension between the United States and Mexico. Part of the reason why there's tension is that we're going to have the United States investing a lot of money in Mexico, and any sort of instability there could threaten the money that has been invested. For Woodrow Wilson, then, Mexico is the best example of moral diplomacy, where we have a government that has been toppled, a military dictator who takes over, American interests are jeopardized, and Woodrow Wilson is going to decide that he needs to intervene. When he decides to move in, he's being inspired by the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst, and for Woodrow Wilson, he's going to try to figure out ways to reinstate what he considers to be a good government. This is going to lead him to invade Mexico, because we have an incident called the Tampico incident, where we have United States sailors who are captured by the Mexicans. They're quickly released, but we don't get a release that has the same sort of pomp and circumstance that Americans believe that they should. And then what's going to happen afterwards is Woodrow Wilson is going to stage an invasion of the port of Veracruz. Part of this is to take control of a major seaport that the Mexicans have, but part of it is also for fear that when America is having tensions with Mexico, Germany is making overtures towards Mexico in 1914. Germany's sending in weapons. They're trying to form a tight relationship with the Mexicans. And what I would like you to make a connection of in your notes is later on when the Zimmerman note happens and Mexico and Germany start talking about a potential alliance. This is the incident that you should think back to. The Americans are very nervous about what could happen if this corrupt government is able to form an alliance with Germany. Eventually, what's going to be taking place is we're going to see the government get toppled again, with Carranza taking over after Huerta is removed from power. We also have Pancho Villa, who is a rival politically, and he is involved in attacks along the Mexican-American border. He is chased through the backcountry by General Pershing, who will become famous during World War I. But we've got tensions going on between Mexico and America that are notable that you'll want to be able to speak about when you are taking your next test. The major element of Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy, though, is going to be his intervention in World War I. And so there are dates that you should keep in mind when you think about American involvement. The actual war goes from 1914 until 1918. And the war itself is going to begin for a really small purpose. We have an assassination of Archduke Ferdinand from Austria-Hungary, and he is killed by a man in Serbia who is feeling nationalistically very angry at one of the leaders of Austria-Hungary for their incursions into this area. Instead of being a small, localized war, though, it becomes World War I. And so for you guys, in your notes, here are the key things you want to be able to mention both this year and next year when you take world history to explain why World War I happens. We call it the main causes of World War I. Number one, we have militarism. We have a lot of countries around the world who are putting their pride behind their military. The idea of having a strong military is seen as a positive for them. Many of their leaders will start wearing military uniforms or trumpeting their military exploits. In Europe, they also have an alliance system that you guys are playing around with inside your game that you guys are playing in class, where these alliances are meant to create almost like a danger for their enemies, so that if you attack one country, you're attacking them and all of their alliances, which should be a deterrent, but we're going to see that instead it drags in a bunch of countries into a war where they don't really have a lot of personal stake in the conflict, but they've got a lot of things they would like to gain because they're all feeling imperialistic. They believe that they're building empires, they have conquered resources around the world, and now they're looking at possibly squaring off against one another in Europe to see who can become the dominant force. And then finally, nationalism. This is what your flag and national anthems have been about. We have now been learning for a long time about American nationalism, the belief that we are a city on a hill, that there's American exceptionalism. You saw it during imperialism with the idea that America had this greatness, and you also saw that playing out through the idea of manifest destiny. This is not a uniquely American sort of thing. So we're going to find that around the world we have countries that are nationalistically believing that they're great, and so much so that many of these countries believed during World War I that all they need to do is fight the war with their new military technologies, and they will win the war in about 6 months. And sadly, what we're going to find is that's not the case at all. They're going to instead get bogged down in a really heavy conflict. So we're going to take a look at our documentary next about World War I in Europe, and take a look at what's happening there. But this is 1914 to 1918 for the war itself. America's only involved from 1917 to 1918, and that's your key when you're studying American history. The turning point for the war for us is our entry, because for the longest time, Americans are going to try to figure out ways not to get involved in that war.
One year after Woodrow Wilson's election as President of the United States, Europe went to war. Wilson had pledged to continue the progressive reforms that were improving American government, business, work, and living conditions. Sadly, just 4 years later, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. Extenuating world events had changed his mind, and America entered World War I. It was called by some the war to end all wars. Socialists dubbed it the Imperialist War. Soldiers often called it the Trench War. World War I was, in fact, the first modern war, a war waged with the ingenuity of the industrial age, from telegraphs to tanks, movies to machine guns. Despite being a modern war, the roots of World War I were steeped in Europe's tumultuous past. As far back as 1870, France and Germany were enemies. When Germany won the Franco-Prussian War, it seized two French provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. From then on, a competitiveness for European leadership evolved between the two countries, and a spirit of nationalism gripped them both. This nationalism went far beyond simply maintaining patriotic feelings for one's country. Instead, Germany, France, and other European countries believed that the interests of their homeland should always be put ahead of world cooperation. The resulting contempt for one country by another inevitably led to the risk of war. Nationalism was at the root of conflicts between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Russians believed that they were the protector of all of Europe's Slavic people, regardless of which government they happened to live under. For example, Serbia was an independent country, but millions of other Serbs lived under Austria-Hungary's rule. The result was an intense rivalry between Russia and Austria-Hungary for influence over Serbians in the country of Serbia. Poland had been divided among Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, and wanted to reunite in their own Polish state with self-rule. The Czechoslovakians also wanted freedom and self-determination. Under Austria-Hungary's rule, they were not even allowed to use their own language. Consequently, by 1914, Europe was a hotbed of nationalism, and tensions ran high between the governments and their constituents. While the spirit of nationalism flourished across Europe, many countries were building their global empires. Great Britain and Germany were colonizing Africa and the Middle East in a frenzy of imperialism. France and Germany were now rivals at home and abroad as they clashed over control of Morocco. Russia turned its attention to Europe as she sought control over the Serbs. The contest for international trade, resources, and land soon resulted in a buildup of military strength. The British, Germans, French, Italians, Japanese, and Americans began an arms race, stockpiling weapons, recruiting armies, and launching battleships to protect their interests at home and abroad. As each country amassed countless weapons and beefed up their army and navies, they saw the wisdom of agreeing to military alliances, mutual treaties of assistance that would commit each nation to support one another should they be attacked. By 1914, there were two major defense alliances. The Triple Entente, later called the Allies, consisted of France, Great Britain, and Russia, although Russia had a separate treaty with Serbia. The other, the Triple Alliance, later called the Central Powers, included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. Italy would later join the Allies. For a little while, these military alliances served as a type of checks and balances system, with each nation reluctant to upset the balance of power. But despite these alliances, war soon erupted. A single event would soon tip the scale. On June 28, 1914, in the capital of Bosnia, a village called Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie were waving to the happy crowds from their motorcade, when a young man leapt from the sidewalk and shot them both dead. The assassin turned out to be a member of a secret society called the Black Hand, whose goal was to reunite all Serbs under one rule. The assassination was used by the Austria-Hungary government as an opportunity to make an example of Serbia and squelch any nationalist uprisings in the future. 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. If it weren't for the military alliances, it might have been a relatively small, localized conflict. Instead, one nation after another was pulled into the fight due to their treaties of support. In order to aid its Serbian allies, Russia mobilized its armed forces. Germany, who was obligated by treaty to support Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia 2 days after that. Subsequently, Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France. And 1 day later, Great Britain, who had a treaty with France, declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. World War I had begun. As Germany invaded the neutral country of Belgium, no one foresaw how long the war would last and how gruesome the cost would be. Over 65 million people fought. Over 20 million were wounded. Between 9 and 10 million died on the battlefield, and another 20 million lost their lives due to hunger and disease related to the war. The magnitude of the killing was unprecedented. In just the first 3 months of the war, nearly the entire original British Army was wiped out. Despite all the carnage, the battle lines remained almost stationary in France. The Western Front, as it was known, was defined by 2 lines of trenches, zigzagging across northern and eastern France for thousands of miles. Wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast and stand erect to fire their machine guns, the trenches were choked with mire, rats, and lice. German soldiers occupied one line, Allied soldiers the other. Between them lay a no-man's land, filled with barbed wire and mud, smoldering with bomb craters. From time to time, soldiers would storm out of these trenches and attempt to overrun the enemy, only to be met with a hail of bullets. Both sides suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties while accomplishing practically nothing, as the battle lines remained essentially unchanged. Meanwhile, the tools of technology, which had provided prosperity for the industrialized world, were now being used to create more efficient and more ghastly weapons. A soldier described the shocking sight of a machine gun that could fire 500 to 600 bullets per minute.
I saw trees as large as a man's thigh, literally cut down by the stream of lead.
In 1914, the German army deployed their new cannon against Belgium. Big Bertha, as it was called, could hurl an 1,800-pound shell 9 miles. A year later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans introduced poison gas to warfare. Soon, both sides used chemical weapons like chlorine, which suffocated its victims, or mustard gas that burned the skin and blinded its casualties. By 1916, the British Army began using tanks in battle with great success. Before long, however, German soldiers realized that flamethrowers, weapons that could shoot a stream of flaming gasoline, could be used to stop them. Balloons.
So as you've seen, we've got a world war that is broken out over in Europe between the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. And for America, what we want to watch is from 1914 to 1917, America is going to be thrilled to be isolationists. They're going to love the idea that they've got oceans on either side to be able to protect them. And they also really like the advice of George Washington, who warned them back around the Revolutionary times that America should try to maintain neutrality and isolation from European involvement, because in Europe they've got a bunch of alliances that have just toppled into a massive mess, and these are going to be shifting alliances, so we're going to see countries switch from one side to another. Now, when we study World War I, we focus on the Western Front, and so this is going to be the front that you saw in France that is characterized by trench warfare. This warfare is going to be defensive in nature, and so they're going to be using technologies that are very good at covering an area defensively, whether it's machine guns that are now water or air-cooled around the barrels so that they don't overheat. They're using Joseph Glidden's barbed wire, as you see right here. They've got cannons that they're using for artillery that is launching poison gas. The most famous of them is mustard gas, which interacts with your mucous membranes to essentially cause a burning to happen, and then what'll happen is that'll then cause scarring and eventually enough damage to possibly kill. With mustard gas, especially when you breathe it in, it sinks to the bottom of the trenches because it's heavier than air, And if you breathe it into your lungs, it burns the inside of your lungs, and then they start weeping fluid, and then you drown on that fluid. You've got also airplanes buzzing above the trenches, and this area right here is known as no man's land. And so you've got out in the middle of this area a pockmarked place that it's going to be very hard to hide in, and many people are going to be sent in a normal sort of attack pattern. The cannons will open up and fire on a portion of the trench line. Then you will be called out of the trenches to march slowly across the middle of no man's land, where many people get knocked down by machine guns. But then your issue is if you take over a chunk of trench, that's fine. But these trenches are built sequentially, so they started off this far away, then they worked up to being this far away, then they worked up to here. So if you take over this chunk of trench, not only do you have then your enemy very close to you here, but you've also got enemies to this side and to this side that are just disconnected by small chunks or breaks that are inside the trench. And so it's really hard to figure out ways to break through. Late in the war, we'll start using tanks in a much more strategic way, but for the better part of 3 years, we are stuck and bogged down in trench warfare. Now, for Woodrow Wilson, he is going to announce that he wants to remain neutral, but there is a problem that you should be witnessing when you take a look at what's going on with the United States. The United States has immigrants from all the different countries that are involved in World War I, but America at this point has had their great rapprochement that we studied during your imperialistic chapter. They now realize they are culturally closer to the British, and they're very much angry about how the Germans invaded through neutral Belgium, and there's a feeling that they are the Huns who are attacking their neighbors, and they are not to be sympathized with. So inside of America, there's going to be an anti-German backlash that is going to sweep throughout the United States, and there's going to be a feeling that the United States and Germany are not going to be able to see things the same way. But you'll notice that when we take a look at the number of people who are in our country from all of these different places, you're going to find that isolation and neutrality makes the most sense because of all the diversity that we have going on here. As we look at the Germans then, there's going to be this feeling that the Germans are the Americans' enemies. There's going to be people inside the United States who are inflaming tensions about American involvement in the war. There's the attempts by the Mexicans to work with the Germans to get weapons into their country. And so for most Americans, while they're hoping to stay out of war, Germany becomes very scary to them. The pattern that we want you to notice, though, is notice how America is going to do during this war what they tried to do with England and France during the period of the late 1700s and early 1800s. America is going to try to trade with everybody that's involved in the war because they would like to profit off of the war that's going on overseas. They're going to need food, they're going to need supplies, and America has a lot of those. America has also been gambling on the war, so J.P. Morgan and other bankers are lending gigantic amounts of money to the countries in Europe that we will eventually team up with, England and France. And many people are going to accuse America of going to war not because it's the right thing to do, but perhaps because we're trying to protect the money of millionaires who have lent it to countries that towards the end of the war will be in danger of losing the conflict. So we have massive amounts of money that's heading over to Europe to try to help them to get through the war, and you'll notice very little of that money is heading over to Germany. For Germany, their problem that they're going to be running into also is they've got an issue with American neutrality because the Americans are claiming that they're neutral, but in actuality, when they trade over to Europe, they're going to find that they can trade easily with the British, easily trade with French, but when they try to go to Germany, the British Navy is going to stop our ships, but they're not going to attack them. Instead, they're going to capture our ships, steer them to British ports, buy all of the supplies that we had on the ships that were destined for Germany, and then they'll send them back to America empty. The Germans are going to get so mad about this that they're going to start using their U-boats. And so this is the first war where we have submarine warfare, and that's going to become a key element of World War I. And so these submarines are going to be controversial because of the fact that they do not obey the international laws about warfare on the seas. On the seas, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to approach a ship that is in the merchant marine that's not a naval ship, and you're supposed to warn them that you are about to approach them. What you're then supposed to do is give them the opportunity to get off of their ship before you destroy it. But this is now the era of radios, of airplanes, and these submarines are not very, very much prepared to defend themselves. They run on diesel. And so what they'll do is they'll run on diesel above the water and then on batteries below the water, but they can only operate underneath the water for short periods of time. So the submarines cannot obey international laws. They will pop up, they'll blow up merchant ships, travel ships, and then they will pop back underneath the water and evade any sort of observation. And so for the Germans, they're going to start blowing up tons of American and British ships that are heading over across the ocean, but that's going to give them an even worse reputation of possibly being diabolical because of what they're doing to the shipping. As you take a look at this map right here, what I would like to highlight for you is the torpedoing of the Lusitania in 1915. And what I want you to think about is what we discussed when we talked about the Boston Massacre back during the Revolutionary times. Boston Massacre happens in 1770. The Revolution begins in 1775. So while it feels like it should be the start of the war, it's not. In this case, we're going to be looking at the Lusitania, which is a passenger ship that left America in 1915. It's a British ship loaded with British people and 100+ Americans. When the Lusitania left, there had been warnings in the newspapers about how it was going to be torpedoed by the Germans. They had it in their sights, they were planning on blowing it up, and Americans were warned not to get on the ship. But the Americans felt like they should be able to travel the seas freely because as Americans, they should be able to travel with neutrality without anybody threatening them. So the Lusitania went across the ocean, traveling straight across the ocean, not zigzagging or trying to avoid submarines. And in 1915, it got torpedoed. And the tragedy that happened there was they had hundreds of people killed. Their bodies were washing ashore in England regularly for the next few weeks. And for the United States, they're going to be angry about what took place. Your dates that you need to keep in mind, though, is America is not going to get into the war until 1917. So the Lusitania is not the reason why America enters the war. In fact, they're going to just make threats to the Germans that they need to stop their U-boat traffic. And so when we take a look at our U-boats here, the German term for these is Unterseeboot or undersea boat, and so this is their submarines. But for the Lusitania, this attack is something that angers the people in the United States. It is not the start of World War I for the Americans. Instead, the Americans are going to threaten the Germans, but they're not going to jump into the war. Woodrow Wilson takes pride in the idea of being isolationist. He wants to stay out of the war. We're going to see another ship sunk in August of 1915, the Arabic. And then finally in 1916, we have a French ship, the Sussex, attacked. And finally in 1916, the Germans are so frightened of America now entering the war because they keep attacking these ships that they're going to create the Sussex Pledge, which is going to announce to the world that they are done attacking passenger and merchant ships without warning for fear that they might drag the United States into a conflict. We're going to jump back then into your presentation and take a look at what air combat looked like, water combat looked like, and then we'll take a look at how America enters into the war.
Balloons and then airplanes were converted into weapons of war. When Germany attacked the Belgian city of Liège in 1914, it was the first time civilians were killed by a warplane. Planes were fitted with machine guns and loaded with bombs, and soon began dueling in air-to-air combat. These dogfights became a common sight over the skies of Europe. Germany's leading fighter pilot, Manfred Richthofen, nicknamed the Red Baron by the British because of his brightly painted red Albatross airplane, shot down 80 Allied aircraft before being struck by a bullet from the trenches and crashing to his death.
If I should come out of this war alive, I will have more luck than brains.
Even more destruction was waiting on and under the Atlantic Ocean as Germany pressed its Unterseeboots, its submarines, into the battle. German submarines, U-boats, patrolled the Atlantic, firing torpedoes on merchant ships trying to deliver supplies to the Allies. It aroused the anger of Americans in particular because they felt that this was a violation of the principle of the freedom of the seas, long a cornerstone of United States foreign policy. Germany then launched a U-boat blockade in response to the British blockade along the German coast, which in theory prevented contraband, weapons, and military supplies from reaching Germany. But the British definition of contraband was wide-sweeping, including food and fertilizer for crops. 750,000 Germans died of starvation during the British blockade. 75,000 people lost their lives due to German submarine warfare. The blockades continued the pattern of war begun in the trenches. Everywhere, the fighting was inconclusive, while the new technologically advanced weapons made the lack of victories more devastating.
So as you've seen with the warfare that's taking place, this is highly technological. It's very destructive. It's the bloodiest war ever in world history to that point. When we look at 1916, Woodrow Wilson is facing a problem. He is not wanting to get involved in the war, and we've got a lot of Americans who still want to remain isolated, but Woodrow Wilson is feeling pressures from around the world where England and France are facing difficulties, and Mexico is getting approached by Germany. And so with Woodrow Wilson, he is going to be running for president again. Wilson is going to be running in this election against Charles Evans Hughes, who is going to be running as a Republican. And what we're going to see with Woodrow Wilson is he's going to have a winning slogan where he's going to announce that he is the one keeping us out of war, and a lot of Americans are going to embrace that. In this election, Woodrow Wilson is going to win this election, barely, but he's going to win it in his own right. So instead of splitting like he did with the Republicans, splitting themselves in half, Woodrow Wilson is going to be winning this election on his own right. The problem is, shortly afterwards, he is going to find himself dragged into the war. And the reason why he's dragged into the war is because of the fact that in 1917, he is going to be announcing that he wants to have peace without victory over in Europe. He starts mentioning that the United States wants to have this done, but then the Germans are going to announce that they're going to be reopening submarine warfare on January 31st, and so they turn down this whole offer that's coming from the United States. What's happening, though, is Woodrow Wilson again says that until the Germans do something to threaten the United States, he is going to still remain neutral. The thing that changes things is going to be two different events that happened in 1917. Number one, the Zimmermann Note, where we have a foreign secretary from Germany who is going to propose to the Mexicans that they should form an alliance where the Mexicans should attack the United States, distract the United States from the war effort in Europe until Germany is able to win the war. Now, this telegram was intercepted by the British and then given to the Americans at the appropriate time. And that appropriate time was when the Germans reopened their submarine warfare, where they then all of a sudden had two different elements that made the Americans feel threatened. Submarines were attacking their ships, the Mexicans are being approached by the Germans, and it's at this point that America is going to decide to jump into the war. The third thing that's going to bring the Americans in, though, is that there's a revolution in Russia. Vladimir Lenin, a name that should go into your notes, is going to lead a gigantic Russian revolution. It's one of the weirdest stories when it comes to how he gained power, because he was hiding in Germany while the Russian government was having troubles. The Tsar Nicholas, was having trouble holding together his people, and Vladimir Lenin approached the Germans asking for a train to get back to Russia to lead a revolution, and that was provided to him. And shortly afterwards, in 1917, the Russian Revolution took place. Russia became communist. They declared that the war was a war for rich people that was being fought by poor people, and once the communist revolution was successful, Russia then dropped out of the war, and this is going to create a massive problem. Germany now no longer needs to have any troops on the Eastern Front. They'll move all of their troops to the Western Front. On the Western Front, France and England have been struggling, and now they're going to face the entire brunt of the attacks that are coming from the Germans. And so for the United States, we are now about to enter the war, and that's going to be the turning point not just for America's war, but also for Europe's war. When England and France get reinforcements from the Americans, they're going to be able to then be resilient and fight back against the Germans and be able to defeat their onrush. What we will find for the United States, though, this is ending an idea that's been around ever since George Washington, this idea that we should be isolationist and keeping ourselves out of European business because their shifting alliances are so hard to navigate, and committing troops to this area means that you're fighting for somebody else's interests, not for your own interests. For Woodrow Wilson, though, notice this quote. This is moral diplomacy. He wants to make the world safe for democracy. And he is going to try to figure out how to explain to the American people that this will be the war to end all wars. We will show the world how great America is because we're not fighting for riches or conquest. We are fighting for good democracies to conquer power-crazed individuals who are taking us into a really terrible war. For Woodrow Wilson, he also believes that as a progressive, the reason why the wars are taking place is because the people over in Europe are ignorant to the way that government could be, and so he believes that he's bringing ideas into the war that he could then share with them. With Wilson also, he is talking about the idea of peace without victory, where he still wants to hold on to the idea of having an end to the war that will not create hurt feelings, and he's going to struggle with figuring out how to get that done. His goal is the 14 points, and so when he is going off to the war, his idea is that he wants to have an ending to the war that's going to do these things. It's going to get rid of all of our secret treaties, like the ones you guys have been doing in your war or peace game, because those are the things that then encourage us to go to war. He wants to create freedom of the seas, where you're going to be able to travel the oceans without threat of being attacked by somebody secretly. He also wants to get rid of economic barriers to try to figure out ways to create free trade, and that's essentially getting rid of tariffs and other sorts of things that could slow down trade. He also wants to figure out ways to reduce armaments. If he could, he would like to figure out ways to have every country have just a defensive army, but not an offensive army. And then finally, what he wants to do is he wants to figure out ways so that the colonies around the world can also be thinking legitimately about how to create boundaries for specific ethnic groups or cultural groups so that they can govern themselves rather than being governed from the outside. For Woodrow Wilson, these messages that he's going to be delivering, especially about the colonies that you see right here, are going to have an unintended effect. There are going to be people who are in the Caribbean, who are in the Pacific, places like Vietnam and other sorts of locations, who when they hear Woodrow Wilson talking like this, they are excited, they're stunned, and they're going to eventually be shocked negatively when they find out that Wilson is being pretty idealistic, and he's going to betray a lot of these principles later on. For Woodrow Wilson, he also starts talking about self-determination, allowing groups that have been oppressed in the past the opportunity to figure out for themselves how to govern themselves, like democracy, like freedom. And then finally, what he wants to create is a League of Nations, an organization in Europe where if there's a war that's about to break out, all the member countries will come together, discuss the issues that they're having, and then hopefully work them out so that we don't end up with a war. So these are the ambitions that Woodrow Wilson has, and what we want to take a look at then is how does that weave into the ending of the war once America arrives. They're going to arrive in 1917. The war will end in 1918. And so here's the ending of America in the 20th century, World War I, the war in Europe.
Into this battle of death and despair came the United States in the spring of 1917, despite President Woodrow Wilson's promise that the U.S. could stay neutral.
So far as I can remember, this is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war.
Most Americans, though they felt sympathy for the plight of Europeans, saw no reason to join a fight 3,000 miles away. At the time of Wilson's second inauguration, immigrants constituted 1/3 of the United States population. More than 8 million German Americans lived in the U.S. and naturally felt sympathy toward their former homeland. America had the closest ties with the Allies. The U.S. shared a common language and history with England and many democratic institutions. America traded with Great Britain and France twice as much as with Germany, and stories of German war atrocities had outraged many citizens of all ethnic backgrounds. Still, most Americans wanted to remain neutral, but that was not to be, primarily for two reasons. America entered the war largely to ensure that the Allies would be able to repay the huge debts owed to the United States, and America had to prevent Germany from threatening U.S. shipping. A change in American attitude occurred when the British ship Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat. Of the 1,198 who were killed, there were 128 Americans. More ships were sunk, incurring more loss of American lives. When the German Kaiser announced on January 31, 1917, that U-boats would sink all ships in British waters, whether they were hostile or neutral, there seemed little choice but to enter the war. The discovery of the Zimmermann telegram cemented that decision. It was a coded note from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico, promising U.S. territory to Mexico in return for joining the German cause.
We make Mexico a proposal or alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
A little over a month later, Congress formally declared war on Germany and the Central Powers. The American public was shocked, but there was still no rush to enlist. The result was that Congress voted overwhelmingly for a draft, requiring eligible men to register with the government. Of the 24 million who signed up, 3 million were chosen by lottery to serve. Women were not drafted, and the Army would not even let them enlist. The Navy and Marines accepted women volunteers for non-combat positions. 13,000 served as nurses, clerks, stenographers, secretaries, and telephone operators. Women could become Army nurses, but they did not receive the benefits, equal pay, or military rank of Army men. The number of African Americans who served in World War I was double their proportion in the general population. African American soldiers were segregated into separate units and living quarters, and were not allowed to join the Navy or the Marines. For the first time in history, some African Americans were trained to be Army officers, though they were only allowed to be in charge of African American troops. The renowned all-African American 369th Infantry Regiment, dubbed the Harlem Hellfighters, saw more continuous duty on the front lines than any other American regiment. 2 of the 369th soldiers were the first Americans ever to receive the French military honor, the Cross of War. Of course, before any American soldiers were able to fight in World War I, the United States had to get troops and supplies to Europe. The costs of such an operation were staggering. To raise money and get the resources needed, the United States government implemented extraordinary measures. First, the federal government took control of the economy and gave the president the power to fix prices and regulate certain war-related industries. President Wilson next established the War Industries Board and appointed millionaire financial expert Bernard Baruch to head it. Wilson often called him Dr. Facts because of his ability to assemble, coordinate, and distribute details about war materials and production.
Every man has a right to be wrong in his opinions, but no man has a right to wrong in his facts.
No detail, however seemingly trivial, escaped his scrutiny. Baruch noticed that 8,000 tons of steel were used each year to make ladies' corsets. He asked American women to give up that fashion in support of the war. They did, and the steel saved could be employed to build 2 battleships. The board encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency and eliminate waste. It also established price controls, allocated raw materials, and told manufacturers what they needed to produce in order to help the war effort. As a result, industrial production increased by 20%. Other government agencies controlled the railroads, regulated the use of coal and oil, and mediated labor disputes, avoiding crippling strikes. The War Industries Board also created a massive publicity campaign, encouraging the public to contribute to the war effort by planting victory gardens and observing meatless meals, so food could be sent overseas to the troops. Gasless Sundays and lightless nights soon followed.
My Tuesdays are meatless. My Wednesdays are wheatless. I'm getting more eatless every day.
In order to conserve energy, the War Industries Board even adopted an idea first championed by Benjamin Franklin: daylight savings time, to take advantage of the longer days of summer and use less electricity. And finally, to raise the $33 billion cost of the war, the government took 2 actions. First, it established an excess profits or war profits tax on corporate earnings and higher income taxes on wealthier citizens. Taxes were raised on tobacco, liquor, and luxury goods as well. These actions collected about 1/3 of the money needed. The rest was raised by appealing to Americans' strong sense of patriotism. Liberty bonds were sold. These, in essence, loaned money to the government to fight the war. Movie stars and newspapers, parades and billboards all carried the message to buy bonds. Amazingly, on average, every adult American lent the war effort about $400, a large amount at the time. Even with the money necessary to fight the war, the government realized they would need the popular support of Americans, most of whom had been either neutral or openly against involvement. Therefore, President Wilson appointed a former muckraking journalist, George Creel, to head the Committee on Public Information, our nation's first propaganda agency. Creel was a giant when it came to advertising and public relations. He called his committee the world's greatest adventure in advertising. Creel convinced the best writers, artists, musicians, and advertising people of the day to help him sell the war. From booklets and books for Americans in various languages to anti-government propaganda messages for our enemies. Creel even got into the movie business with features such as Under Four Flags, with the help of famous film director D.W. Griffith. These pro-war movies were not only hits, they actually made money for the cause. $852,744. Remarkable when you realize that it only cost a nickel to see a movie back then. Simply put, Creel helped make an unpopular war popular. His masterstroke was the creation of a national force of 75,000 men who would deliver a patriotic 4-minute speech anytime, anywhere. The 4-minute men spoke on the draft, rationing, bond drives, and victory gardens. By the end of the war, they had delivered more than 7.5 million speeches to 314 million listeners. Musicians gave voice to the war. Songs like Till We Meet Again, It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary, Keep the Home Fires Burning, and Over There kept American spirits high. Meanwhile, the immense task of transporting troops to France began. After years of relying on foreign vessels to take American goods overseas, America's supply of ships was limited. Consequently, shipyard workers were exempt from the draft or given deferments to make shipbuilding a priority industry. A new construction technique called fabrication, a process by which parts were built elsewhere and then assembled in a central shipyard, substantially reduced the time needed to build ships. The system worked and worked well. In a single day, appropriately the 4th of July, 1918, America launched 95 ships. Rear Admiral William S. Sims decided that the best way to get troops and supplies safely past the German U-boats was to use a convoy system. That meant that merchant and troop transport ships would cross the Atlantic in large groups, escorted by a guard of heavily armed destroyers and cruisers, circling the fleet. The plan cut shipping losses in half. 100 submarine chaser boats and 500 airplanes were also used to stop U-boats from sinking ships bound for Europe. Remarkably, of the 2 million men who sailed to Europe during the war, only 100 were lost to U-boat torpedoes. General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force. Pershing believed in aggressive action in combat and was highly regarded by his superiors and the men he commanded. Black Jack, as he was popularly known among the troops, was understood to be fair, courageous, and a top-notch administrator. At first, American troops were employed mainly as replacements for European casualties. By April of 1918, Pershing convinced the Allies that Americans should fight as a separate army.
We came American, we shall remain American, and go into battle with Old Glory over our heads. I will not parcel out American boys.
Accordingly, American soldiers, called doughboys because of their white belts that they cleaned with pipe clay or dough, fought together under the command of French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. By now, the government of Russia had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. And Russia withdrew from the war, signing a peace treaty with Germany. This meant the Germans could now consolidate their army and concentrate on a single front. By May of 1918, the Germans managed to get within 50 miles of Paris. America had arrived over there just in time to help stop the German advance at Cantigny. A few weeks later, the Doughboys helped thwart the German attacks at Chateau Thierry and below Wood and Reims. In late summer, the Allies, with America's help, triumphed in the Second Battle of the Marne, and in September mounted offensives against Germans at Saint-Mihiel and in the Meuse-Argonne regions, where 1.2 million U.S. troops fought. By October, it was clear the tide had turned against Germany and the Central Powers, as German troops began to retreat all along the front. The victory was not without devastating cost, however. All told, the United States lost 48,000 men in battle. Approximately 62,000 died of disease, and another 200,000 were wounded and needed immediate medical care.
The Army is only 12 miles away. I have Americans, English, Irish, and French, and apart, in the corners, are Germans. They have to watch each other die side by side. The cannon goes day and night, and the shells are breaking over and around us. I have to write many sad letters to American mothers.
Thankfully, an end to the slaughter was not far off. Although on the home front, the effects of the war were enormous. From fines and imprisonment for those who opposed the war to new roles for women and African Americans, World War I was proving to be a major turning point in American history.
As you've seen, America is going to enter the war, and within 1 year they're going to quickly win the war. And now we transition into taking a look at the home front and what is happening here inside the United States. Number one, what we're going to see is with Woodrow Wilson, he is going to apply his principles for progressivism on the war itself. He wants to try to figure out how can you turn the war into a moral crusade and also turn it into an efficient scientific process to try to maximize American results. So the first organization we want to notice is the CPI, the Committee on Public Information. It's headed by a guy named George Creel, and so this is also known as the Creel Commission. And he is going to be the guy who is involved in propaganda for the war. So he's going to try to sell the war effort to the people of the United States and to the world. His motivation, his mobilization is going to involve a whole bunch of people spread out through the world, whether it's popular actors, musicians, whatever, who will be our 4-minute men, and women who will go out into the streets or into movie theaters or whatever to try to argue for why you should be patriotic, to poster campaigns, like many of the posters like this one that are propaganda, to try to stir people into engaging in the war effort. And if you look in the back of my classroom, you'll see many posters that are similar to that, especially the Uncle Sam I Want You poster that becomes popular during World War I. In these movements, there's going to be songs and parades and posters and other sorts of propaganda spread around as well. And for America, what's going to be happening is they're going to enthusiastically back this effort, but they're also going to very much ramp up the idea of American exceptionalism, where they start believing Woodrow Wilson that this can be the war to end all wars, that this will be the war to make the world safe for democracy. And when those promises aren't fulfilled, you're going to find a lot of Americans are pretty disappointed by that. The other issue that you have, though, is by so much championing the idea of being involved in the war, on the right-hand side, if you were a German inside this country, you were in serious danger. Many Americans came over from Germany, lived in farm communities, and they continued speaking German, behaving in German ethnic sorts of ways, and they're going to find themselves under attack. And so German music, German classes, German books, sauerkraut and hamburger get renamed, because anything Germanic at this time is going to be seen as un-American. And so those people who are seen as not truly American are going to face a backlash. Even more so, we see two laws that are very controversial back then and nowadays. They are the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which is very similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts from a century earlier during John Adams' presidency. Espionage means spying, and so the Espionage Act is going to make it illegal to be seen as somebody who is spying or undermining the war efforts of the United States. The Sedition Act is doing things to try to work against the American war effort. So a lot of people who are seen as radicals, like Eugene V. Debs, or Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the IWW, are going to find themselves thrown in jail, and oftentimes they're deported to Russia. The industrial workers of the world, the labor union that is going to be huge during that time period, they're going to get cracked down severely because they are still striking during the war, and they are seen as un-American. And the heat that's coming for this effort is following Russia's conversion to communism during their revolution. The fear is that if communism can take off over in Russia, why can't it take off over here in the United States? Since there's a massive backlash. This is going to be very much the reason why you watch the progressive era end at this point. There's a feeling that we're flirting with becoming socialist or communist or anarchistic because of how far we've come with our reforms and how many people are still pushing for more. Now, in 1919, we had a Supreme Court case versus Schenck versus the United States, and what this court case was arguing about was whether or not the Espionage and Sedition Acts were legal, and what they determined was, in a time of danger, you don't have the freedom of speech like you have during normal peace times. The example they use is if you're in a crowded theater, you don't have the freedom to yell fire in a way that could cause a stampede. Now, the argument in this case, though, is that if you are in a time of wartime, the government can then determine what you can and can't say with freedom of speech, and that creates a very dangerous threshold for what you do and don't have for civil liberties during a time of war. For Woodrow Wilson, though, he's got a big problem. When he was isolationist, he was not even getting prepared for a war with the fear that if he over-prepared for war, he would then become militaristic. And so he's got to massively ramp up his war effort immediately. And the way he's going to do that is with the War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, who is going to become his right-hand man. He is going to coordinate with businesses what they can and can't make and what supplies they can and can't have. When you take a look at this effort, there is definitely a socialistic element to this, with the government taking full control of the war efforts. But what they're also trying to avoid is having unnecessary competition between businesses who are trying to profiteer when we're trying to get as many weapons as quickly as possible. So what you're going to see with Woodrow Wilson is he is going to be controlling the businesses like the railroads and other sorts of factories to make war materials, but then he's also paying them handsomely with contracts and helping them make their factories bigger. So while it is limiting the freedom that these businesses have, it is also giving them a direct payoff of helping them make themselves bigger. You also want to notice the name Herbert Hoover. He is going to lead the Food Administration, and this is where he becomes the first immediately recognizable, where he is going to be working to try to create a group that can get food to our soldiers, and then he also tries to prevent Belgium from starving after Germany pulls back and they're left utterly destroyed. For Hoover, he's going to try a voluntary approach where he's going to ask farmers to start massively increasing their production, which they can do with their tractors. Their problem, though, is that these farmers are going to start massively increasing their production, buying tractors and other sorts of implements, and then we're going to end the war after less than a year. And so they're going to be massively overbuilt, they're going to go into debt, and then this is going to create another economic crisis. For Americans, he's going to do things like have rationing, and he's going to encourage people to cut back on their usage of stuff, having meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and so on, so that they can take care of their own. They're also going to start growing victory gardens so that they can feed themselves without using food that could be sent to our soldiers. During the wartime, then, we're going to find that a lot of Americans are going to be pushing then also to ban alcohol as a sacrifice that would be good for the working people of the time. And so our 18th Amendment is going to come in 1919 that will ban alcohol production, transportation, and sales, but not consumption. So if you still have alcohol, you can still use that. We're going to find then that this is a scary moment for conservatives because the government is about to get much larger to deal with the war effort, but many of them have already been suspicious that this is a trend that they don't like inside of our country. We're going to then find that American workers become our next focus, and so we're going to take a look at our next snippet of our documentary to take a look at how they're developing.
In 1917, America had gone to war, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Not just for the men and women overseas, but also for the Americans left behind on the home front. As over 2 million American soldiers boarded the transport ships bound for France, more than 1 million American women sustained the wartime labor force. A great many jobs, which had previously been considered man's work, were being filled by women. In the factory, the shipyard, and the armed forces. Women plowed the fields, fixed the cars, delivered the mail, ran the elevators and the streetcars, and even wrote the traffic tickets. President Wilson encouraged employers to pay female workers the same wages they had paid men, but few did. Even worse, when the war was over and men returned to the workforce, a great many women were fired. Other women contributed to the war effort by volunteering. They served in the Red Cross, sold Liberty bonds, and planted victory gardens. Others, like Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Catt, raised public awareness by actively demonstrating against war and militarism. As the war dragged on, the nation began to appreciate the valuable contribution made by women in the war effort, creating a prime opportunity for a change in women's civil liberties. On January 10, 1917, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns of the National Women's Party took action. For almost a year, they paraded and picketed the White House, demanding passage of a constitutional amendment granting women's suffrage, the right to vote. Wilson was out of office by the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, but there was no doubt that the new role of women in America during World War I was a catalyst leading to the right to vote. Society also had to come to grips with a new role for African Americans. Like most Americans, African Americans were divided in their opinions about the war. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an editorial in The Crisis, a newspaper published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, urging African Americans to support the war effort.
Let us, while the crisis lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy.
William Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston Guardian newspaper, disagreed. He felt African Americans were victims of racism and should not support a racist government. At home, the war contributed to the large-scale migration of more than 500,000 African Americans into the industrialized cities of the North. They provided the workforce desperately needed to produce wartime goods. In addition, immigration into America had slowed to a trickle, and many immigrants had returned to their native homelands, leaving more jobs to be filled. Despite the many women employed, companies were still short of workers. Many African Americans were anxious to leave the South and its pattern of racial discrimination, low pay, and all too often, life-threatening conditions. Between 1892 and 1919, approximately 3,000 African Americans were killed by lynching, mainly in the South. When northern manufacturing companies sent recruiting agents with free railroad tickets into the South looking for laborers, hundreds of thousands of men and women boarded trains and headed for cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. The Chicago Defender, the most widely read African American newspaper in the South, urged Southern African Americans to come north. Some even wrote the newspaper for advice.
Dear Sir, I have a wife and one child and can hardly feed them. I thought to write and ask you for some information concerning how to get a pass for myself and family. Please don't publish this because we have to whisper this around among ourselves, because the white folks are angry now because the Negroes are going north.
Able-bodied men and women came and found work in places like Henry Ford's assembly lines, where they could make as much as $5 a day, far exceeding anything African Americans could earn in the South. Despite the opportunities in the North, Black Americans found some new and some familiar problems in the North. Many blacks were forced to live in crowded, segregated housing, contributing to the rise of urban black ghettos, and they paid ridiculously high rents for the dubious privilege. African Americans were frequently denied membership in labor unions by white workers. Therefore, they were left few choices other than to accept unpopular positions as scabs or replacement workers employed during strikes. This labor struggle bred resentment among white laborers, their feelings fueled by ignorant racist opinions. Instead of competing with whites, some African Americans became entrepreneurs within the black community itself. They opened stores and insurance agencies, or offered personal services like undertaking and hairdressing. Other African American men and women, allowed few options, worked as domestic servants. In the North, a cook or a laundress earned as much money in a day as she made in a week back south. Domestic servants could earn twice as much in a northern home as a southern home. But northern homes tended to be smaller and more modern, so fewer African Americans were being hired for full-time work. Regardless, jobs, even at the lowest factory pay scale, could earn African Americans $3 a day compared to 50 cents a day in the rural South. But soon, the competition and racial tension between white and black workers led to race riots in dozens of northern cities. In July of 1917, white workers, incensed by the hiring of blacks as strikebreakers at an East St. Louis, Illinois munitions plant, ran through the streets, mindlessly stalking and killing blacks. 49 African Americans and 9 white Americans died. The New York Age reported on the march.
They marched without uttering one word or making a single gesticulation and protested in respectful silence against the reign of mob law, segregation, Jim Crowism, and many other indignities to which race is unnecessarily subjected in the United States.
Just 2 years later, a 17-year-old swam from the black beach to the white beach on the shores of Lake Michigan in Chicago. Whites threw rocks at him until he drowned. Provoked by the whites' barbaric action, blacks revolted. News of the fight reached several neighborhoods, and within hours, fighting broke out there, too. For 3 days and nights, the riot went unchecked until Illinois state troopers finally restored peace. 38 people lost their lives, 23 African American and 15 white, with another 520 citizens injured. James Weldon Johnson, diplomat, poet, novelist, critic, and composer, said the summer of 1919 was the red summer of hate for the bloodshed in racial violence. White America was learning what black Americans had known all along. Racial prejudice wasn't a problem confined to the South. It was an American problem. And African Americans weren't the only ones whose civil liberties were being abused. Once war was declared, conformity, patriotism, and complete support for the war were demanded of all Americans. Freedom of speech and thought was becoming unacceptable. Different language and culture, suspicious. German Americans in particular were scrutinized and their loyalty questioned. Schools dropped German from their language classes. German books were withdrawn from public libraries. German measles was renamed Liberty Measles, and sauerkraut, Liberty Cabbage. Frederick Stock, the distinguished conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was not allowed to conduct, and many other orchestras refused to play the music of Bach and Beethoven. Soon these sentiments manifested into anti-German violence. The most notorious case occurred in Collinsville, Illinois, when German-born Robert Prager was lynched. Intolerance spread beyond German Americans. William Harding, then governor of Iowa, made a brash proclamation.
Conversation in public places, on trains, or over the telephone should be in the English language.
People who spoke Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Czech, on top of those who spoke German, were affected. Elderly women were jailed for speaking German over the telephone. A Lutheran pastor was imprisoned for preaching part of a funeral service for a soldier killed in the war in Swedish. His explanation that he did it because the young man's grandparents couldn't speak English did not sway the judge. Governor Harding even maintained that God did not hear prayers that were spoken in any language other than English. In June of 1917, Congress passed and President Wilson signed the Espionage Act, and 11 months later, the Sedition Act. Under these laws, a person could be fined as much as $10,000 and could be sentenced to as many as 20 years in prison for anti-war activities, like interfering with the draft or with the sale of government bonds. Imprisonment could result from saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive concerning the war effort. Despite the fact that these two acts violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right of free speech, the Supreme Court upheld their constitutionality, claiming that there was a clear and present danger to free speech and a free press during a war. The result was that citizens were harassed purely upon suspicion. Walter Matthey was jailed for the high crime of attending an anti-war meeting and contributing a quarter to the cause. Under the Act, the post office could censor the mail, and over 400 periodicals were banned for a time, including the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times. Robert Goldstein ran afoul of the law with his film, The Spirit of '76. It was just a silent movie about the Revolutionary War, and of course the British were portrayed as America's enemy. Now, however, America and Great Britain were allies, and Goldstein was told to remove scenes of British soldiers shooting colonists. He refused and was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Goldstein served 3 years, and his career never recovered. But the worst treatment under the Espionage and Sedition Acts was reserved for socialists and labor leaders. The founder of the Socialist Party and frequent presidential candidate, Eugene V. Debs, was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on each of 3 counts to be served concurrently for his outspoken opposition to the war.
I have been accused of obstructing the war, I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war.
Undaunted, Debs ran for president from his jail cell in the Atlanta prison in 1920 and got almost 1 million votes. In 1921, President Warren Harding commuted his sentence. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, a person who believes there should be no government, was fined $10,000 and given 2 years in jail for denouncing the draft. On her release, she was promptly deported to Russia. Labor organizer Big Bill Haywood was convicted of sabotaging the war effort because he encouraged workers to strike for fair pay and decent working conditions. Haywood received a sentence of 20 years for his troubles, but jumped bail and fled to Russia, where he remained until his death 10 years later. On President Wilson's last day in office, Congress repealed the Sedition Act. Ironically, while American soldiers fought for freedom in Europe, freedom of speech and civil liberties were being denied to Americans at home.
So as you've seen, there's been a need for more workers inside the factories, and what we want to notice is the different way that labor is going to develop during this time. For the AFL, this is your union that is the very stable, moderate union, and so they're going to be pushing for higher wages, better working conditions, but they recognize that the factories are going to go 24/7, and so for many of these workers, they realize that going on strike would damage their image in front of everybody as looking disloyal. We'll find the IWW, though, is going to be very different. These guys are going to be working in some of the most terrible factory conditions they could possibly imagine, and they're going to be much more radical in their behavior. They will engage in strikes. They will engage in an awful lot of disruption, and that's the reason why you see a backlash against them using the Espionage and Sedition Act. They are seen as dangerous radicals. They argue for the end of capitalism so we can move towards socialism or something else. And so for the IWW, they're going to be having a lot of problems especially following 1919. For African Americans, you want to be able to mention the Great Migration of World War I when you write about African Americans during this time period, because this is the moment that African Americans move in waves up into the northern cities of the United States. Many cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, Minneapolis, and Detroit, and others are going to have large African American neighborhoods that start developing during this time period as African Americans move from sharecropping to the north to find factory jobs. The problem with African Americans moving north, though, is that when white soldiers come back home, there's going to be race riots going on because of the fact that the factory owners will love being able to hire from African American and white workers, and having so many workers will mean that they do not need to increase their wages to find people to work. They'll be able to break unions using African Americans as scab or replacement workers. This is going to lead to what's known as the Summer of Hate, the Red Summer of Hate in 1919, where we have massive race riots happening in the North, and there's a racist backlash against African Americans. Shortly afterwards, we're going to see a reemergence of the KKK as a result of these tensions. Now, what's sad is for many workers, they thought that this would be their moment to be able to elevate their status, and you see that going on with women. Women are going to start elevating their status by working inside the factories, and this will become the final element necessary for women to be able to then gain the right to vote with the 19th Amendment as recognition of how successful they were in helping with the war effort. African Americans, on the other hand, are not going to find great gains as a result of the war, and in fact, when they come home, they're facing intense racism and discrimination, even though many of them served in the military, and many of the people who worked in the factories are not recognized, they're ostracized instead. And your biggest issue is many of these African Americans are going to find themselves living in neighborhoods, losing jobs, and then they will become stereotyped as being lazy and unwilling to work, when in actuality they're going to struggle to find jobs as they get frozen out by factory owners in the North. This is going to then lead us to the end of the conflict, where we're going to have women who are going to be returning back home. They'll be returning to their roles as mothers in 1919, 1920, and we'll see laws passing like the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act, where we're going to see that the government is going to be involved more and more with helping families with mother and infant health care and instruction to help provide an idea of how to be able to raise a healthy family. But the message that's explicit is that women's job is to then leave factories after World War I and return back home to their traditional lifestyle. It's at this point then we transition into taking a look at the end of the war. So America in 1917 sends soldiers over to Europe. The Europeans are desperate for American help. They want to weave the Americans into their military groups, but the Americans do not want to allow that to happen. The Americans are going to open up a draft to try to raise as many men as they possibly can, and women are going to be allowed to enter into the military as well in certain specific roles. As the American soldiers get overseas, they're going to have very limited time to train, they're going to be rushed overseas, and when they arrive in the battles, they're going to find themselves facing overwhelming forces as the Germans all turn from the Russian front and start heading to the Western front instead. For the Americans, though, we're going to find that General Pershing is going to insist that the Americans all fight together in their own groups rather than fighting in groups that are interspersed with the Europeans. Now, as the Americans are heading overseas, one of the things you're going to see is another campaign against disease. But unlike what we saw during the Civil War, we're going to find that during this war, the concern that Americans have are with sexually transmitted diseases. And so you're going to see another element of focusing on how to clean up disease in that sort of viewpoint instead. The war itself for America is very simple. They arrive and they see an onslaught coming from the Germans in 1917 with a last push to try to end the war and take over Paris. As the Americans arrive, fighting places like the Battle of the Marne and other places along the trench lines, they're able to resist the German offense, and then once the Germans play out their offensive, they are exhausted. They have nothing left to give to the war effort. For Americans, you're not going to need to know specific battles. It's the entry of the Americans themselves in 1918 that is going to be the overwhelming thing that ends the war effort. For 1918, then, America is going to suffer casualties, but not nearly to the level of what we see going on with the Europeans. The Europeans are losing millions of people. We end up losing hundreds of thousands of people, which is tragic, but not nearly what the Europeans have encountered. So what's going to happen in 1918 is Woodrow Wilson is going to announce that he wants to have peace without victory. He knows that the Germans are disintegrating, but instead of forcing them to surrender, he's going to force them into an armistice, which is a ceasefire, and they're going to choose to end the war on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. So what is now called Veterans Day was known as Armistice Day back after World War I. For this war, we're going to have millions of people who die, millions more who are injured, and then simultaneously we have the Great Flu Epidemic of 1918. And this flu epidemic is going to kill thousands of people in the United States, millions of people around the world. And it's the reason why we're so concerned about you getting flu vaccines, because this influenza actually hurt kids your age to the age of like the 20s, because it would cause their immune systems to overreact. And so for many Americans, they're exhausted, and many Europeans are the same, because of a war that's highly destructive, flu epidemic that's highly destructive, and they just want to be done. At the end of the war, then, when America arrives over in Europe, what they're finding is they want to arrive and dictate the terms of peace with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. America, though, having lost thousands of people, we're going to encounter the French and the British that have lost thousands more, and they do not want to hear America come in with the idea that they're the ones who have the ideas that everybody must listen to. They think that that sounds kind of arrogant. So Woodrow Wilson is going to head off in 1918 to negotiate the peace, and that's where we'll finish up the rest of your documentary.
Thankfully, the war was coming to a conclusion. Russia had already withdrawn from the battle after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Allied forces had aided the anti-Bolsheviks, however, and this led to long-term mistrust between Russia and the Allies. By November of 1918, the Allies, with fresh new American forces, began to turn the tide of battle, and German soldiers began to retreat along the Western Front. The German Navy ordered its fleet to set out to sea, but the sailors refused. In Germany, soldiers and civilians started organizing revolutionary councils. The people of Berlin rebelled against the Kaiser, who abdicated his throne and escaped to the Netherlands. No final, decisive battle was fought. No Allied soldiers entered German territory. Instead, the German war machine ground to a halt. On the 11th hour of the 11th day, in the 11th month of 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire that ended the war. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace fighter pilot, flew over the trenches when the armistice was declared.
On both sides of no man's land, the trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, gray-green uniforms out of the German. I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, wave their hands. Suddenly, gray uniforms mixed with brown. I could see them hugging each other, dancing, jumping.
The bloodiest war to date was finally over. During its 4 long years, more than 30 nations participated in battle and in death. But even as the war ended, Americans faced still another crisis. A crisis at home that took more lives than the war itself. A flu epidemic gripped the country, and approximately 25% of the population fell ill with high fevers, headaches, and often pneumonia. About 500,000 Americans died. Businesses shut down, telephone service was curtailed, and corpses lay unburied due to a shortage of coffins. The epidemic, like the war, finally subsided, and a weary America looked to President Wilson and the victorious Allies to deliver a lasting peace. Even before the war was over, Wilson had presented his plan for peace to Congress, his 14 points speech.
We entered this war because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible.
Wilson's first 5 points dealt with the issues he felt had caused the war. Nations should no longer engage in secret treaties. The freedom of the seas must be restored, and tariffs should be lowered or removed altogether so free trade could flourish. Wilson demanded an end to the arms race and stockpiling of weapons. He declared that the interest and desires of people living in colonies should be considered by the imperialist countries who ruled them. Wilson's next points addressed boundary changes. Advocating the principle of self-determination, Wilson wanted any new national boundaries to be drawn along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. His last point was the most important to Wilson. He called for the formation of a League of Nations to keep world peace. The members of the League would agree to protect each other from aggression and settle grievances without going to war. Following the ceasefire in December of 1918, Wilson and his wife Edith sailed aboard the SS George Washington for Europe to attend the Versailles Peace Conference. It was the first time in history that an American president left the United States while in office. Wilson was given a hero's welcome. Crowds cheered him. The citizens of Europe saw Wilson as their best hope for a lasting world peace. But the politicians of Europe, particularly British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had won election on the slogan, "Make Germany Pay," and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who had lived through 2 German invasions of France, resisted most of Wilson's ideas. To them, the first and foremost goal of the peace treaty was to punish Germany so she could never wage war again. The peace conference did not include the defeated Central Powers, Russia, and the smaller Allied countries. The so-called Big Four, America, Great Britain, France, and Italy, hammered out the peace treaty among themselves. Time and again, Wilson was forced to concede on elements of his 14 points in return for the establishment of the League of Nations. Finally, on June 28, 1919, the Big Four, along with the leaders of the defeated nations, met at the Palace of Versailles to sign the treaty. The Treaty of Versailles created 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, while the borders of other countries were redrawn. 4 sections of the Ottoman Empire were made temporary colonies under the rule of France and Great Britain until they were ready for independence. President Wilson did manage to prevent some of the more extreme punishments, but the treaty demilitarized Germany, banning her air force and navy and limiting her army to only 100,000 men. Germany was ordered to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. Most debilitating, Germany had to pay reparations, war damages, of $33 billion to the Allies, and admit total responsibility for the war. Certainly, Germany had played a major role in starting World War I, but other countries were equally involved. German citizens found the treaty outrageous, and there was no way the country could ever repay the Allies the money demanded. Instead of providing a lasting peace, the Treaty of Versailles began laying the groundwork for World War II. Wilson returned home to even more disappointment. Instead of enthusiastic support for the treaty and the League of Nations, he found most Americans were now disinterested in foreign policy and wanted to return to the pre-war atmosphere of isolationism. The Republican-controlled Congress, led by Wilson's adversary, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, insisted Wilson alter some of the provisions of the treaty. Wilson was equally stubborn and refused even the smallest compromise. In turn, Wilson, despite the advice of his doctors and close friends that his health was fragile, took his proposals directly to the public. He set out on an 8,000-mile tour of the nation. delivering 35 speeches in 22 days to convince Americans that the treaty deserved approval. He hoped public opinion would force the Senate to agree to the treaty and join the League of Nations. Americans greeted him as enthusiastically as had the Europeans. In late September of 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, he ended his speech by saying to the crowd,
"There seems to me to stand between us and the rejection or qualification of this treaty the serried ranks of those boys in khaki, not only those boys who came home, but those dear ghosts that still deploy upon the fields of France."
The campaign, however, proved too much for President Woodrow Wilson. On October 2nd, he collapsed and was rushed back to the White House. Wilson lay as an invalid as a result of his stroke for more than 2 months. Still, the Senate failed to ratify the treaty. The United States Senate eventually signed a separate peace treaty with Germany, but never joined Wilson's beloved League of Nations. 3 amendments were passed during the Wilson administration. The 17th, providing direct election of senators, the 18th, outlawing alcohol, and the 19th, granting suffrage for women. He is remembered for his progressive reforms, for his failed attempt to convince the Senate to join the League of Nations, and for his prophecy of 1919 that proved chillingly correct 20 years later.
I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war if the nations of the world do not concert the method by which to prevent it.
America remained an observer at League of Nations meetings, but without U.S. participation, the League lacked clout and eventually faltered. World War I had left the country saddened over the loss of so many lives, deeply divided about the League of Nations and what was to be America's role in a global community. Weary of war and the wrenching social upheavals of the Progressive Era, Americans longed for a return to what new President Warren G. Harding called normalcy. The next decade, the 1920s, would bring a brief time of prosperity, new personal freedoms, and stunning social changes. An era forever known as the Roaring Twenties.
So to wrap up World War I, Woodrow Wilson goes off to Europe to negotiate the peace treaty that is going to end the war over in Europe. When he decides to head over for this negotiation, though, he makes some massive mistakes by being very partisan in his decision-making. When he goes over to Europe, he is going to bring only Democrats with him, except for Herbert Hoover. When he goes over to Europe, he is also going to claim that he speaks for everybody, even though a treaty that he signs is going to need to get through the Senate. And so he probably should have brought along Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, the leader of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, a very powerful Republican. For the Republicans, they were very nervous about anything that would get us entangled in European alliances, which is what George Washington warned us to not get into. So in 1919, Woodrow Wilson is going to arrive at the Treaty of Versailles, and he is going to be negotiating at the palace that's just outside of Paris. Now what happens is the Germans send ambassadors to this meeting as well, anticipating that they'll be able to negotiate in this process. But instead, the English and French have gotten the idea that instead of negotiating with Germany as an equal with peace without victory, they're going to take the Germans, show them to a side room, and negotiate while they're in this back room, being left out of the process. Very much how you guys, during your war or peace game, would divide up the spoils of a country that you were taking apart, and you would do that while the other team was watching, but not while including them in the conversation. The decision then at the meeting that we have at the Treaty of Versailles is that the Europeans are going to agree that we can create a League of Nations. And so for America, this is the key that they're going to be able to keep. But what we'll see with Woodrow Wilson is he is going to lose out on so many other different elements. We're going to see the French take over the Saar Valley in Alsace-Lorraine, where these are areas between France and Germany that have a huge amount of natural resources, and so Germany is about to lose land like we saw in the war or peace game. We're going to see that with Italy, Italy's going to try to negotiate for things during these negotiations. And we're going to find that the Italians are going to be largely left out of negotiations because they were very much seen as second-rate sort of allies during the war itself. We're going to also see tensions rising between America and Japan, and also their interests in China. So there's an indication with this treaty process that we are on the verge of something tense with the Japanese, even though we're just wrapping up with World War I. For the Treaty of Versailles, though, instead of being a war to end all wars, this treaty that we create is going to be a punishment for the Germans. Almost everything in the 14 points is excluded, even though the Germans were told that the peace process was going to be based on the 14 points. Many people in Germany will see this as a betrayal, and people like Adolf Hitler will see this as a punishment that was undeserved. And so for many people in the future, they'll see World War II coming from the roots of this treaty that's meant to punish the Germans. For Wilson, he is going to argue that he's done the best that he could, and he is trying to figure out ways to help self-determination, to create the League of Nations. But what happens inside the treaty is the Germans are forced to sign a treaty that does a couple different things. Number one, they have to take the total responsibility for the guilt of the war. They're going to be forced to shrink their armies, their navies, their air force, and for these guys, that's not the only problem they're having. They also have to pay these punishments, reparations, to the English and the French. So whatever debts the English and the French racked up, the Germans are now going to have to pay back those debts. Germany has no way of paying back their money in a reasonable amount of time. And in fact, they just finished repaying those reparations just a few years ago. But what Germany is going to end up doing in the 1920s is they're just going to turn on their printing presses and start printing off cash and sending worthless money to England and France to pay back these debts. They're going to eventually destroy their economy. It's then going to bleed into the world economy, and it's going to be one of the contributing factors to the Great Depression. Now, with Woodrow Wilson, he comes back home after the Treaty of Versailles, and he wants to return triumphantly. But when he brings back his treaty, all he's gotten is the 14 points. And in the 14 points, there's a deal that's an alliance system that says everybody in the League of Nations is on a super team, and if anybody ever attacks a member of the League of Nations, everybody else in the League must back that country up. For many Republicans, they do not want to have entangling alliances like George Washington warned about. They wanted to keep out of the League of Nations. These are known as our irreconcilables. They will never join a League of Nations. There are some people, though, in Congress who would be willing to join the League of Nations if there were modifications made to that alliance system. Henry Cabot Lodge is one of those individuals who would be willing to make a deal, but Woodrow Wilson wants to rush this treaty through, and he does not want to have to negotiate with Republicans. He's proud. He feels like he's done exactly what he's supposed to do, and he feels like this is the signature achievement that he's been able to make. And so we're going to have a battle playing out in front of the Americans of the United States Senate filled with Republicans who believe that they're saving Americans and George Washington's visions from this overreach that Woodrow Wilson is creating with his League of Nations. This battle is going to spill out in 1919. Lodge wants to amend the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson is not going to want to do that, and they battle in public. Woodrow Wilson's plan is to take the issue to the people, so he starts traveling around the country by train to argue why the League of Nations should be allowed, why the Treaty of Versailles should be allowed, and he is going to become so frail as a result of this traveling that he is going to have a stroke in the middle of this traveling around. When he has the stroke, he is bedridden for weeks. And in fact, one of the big questions we have is when he collapses, he ends up being bedridden, and he's also taken to a room in the White House that is closed off, and the only one who really has access is his wife, Edith. And she is going to be doing things with the president during that time period that leads some to wonder if perhaps she might have been running the government instead of him for those weeks that he was incapacitated. The problem is, while he was incapacitated, you then had a problem going on because the treaty was still sitting there unsigned, and the League of Nations, which America insisted be created, is now just sitting there. And so for weeks and weeks, this treaty is going to sit, and then finally at the end of 1919, America is going to reject the Treaty of Versailles. So America insisted on the League of Nations and other 14 points. All they could get was the League. Then they reject the League, so now we have a League of Nations in Europe that we demanded, but we won't end up joining. We're going to end up then not having the war to end all wars. We're going to instead create a separate treaty in 1921 that finally wraps up the war itself. In this battle then, as far as who deserves the blame for this battle over the treaty, the Republicans or the Democrats, you have partisanship that is tearing this all apart, and you have a divide over isolationism versus involvement in the rest of the world that was also dividing these two groups of people. For Woodrow Wilson, though, he's got a problem. He decides to run for re-election again, even though health-wise he's got no ability to keep carrying on. And so he's going to be facing Warren G. Harding, who is going to run for president as a candidate from Ohio. And the Democrats decide to go a different direction with James M. Cox, but his running mate is Franklin D. Roosevelt, who is going to be making his first run for major national office after serving as Assistant Secretary of Navy, the same role that Teddy Roosevelt was handling previously during the Spanish-American War. In this election, we're going to have Warren G. Harding get elected, and what he is going to be doing is he is going to be campaigning with this promise. He is promising a return to normalcy, which means he is telling Americans we're done intervening in Europe, which is not what George Washington wanted us to do anyways, and we're done with progressivism, which he argues is something that is not American, especially since you see what's been happening in 1919, 1920, where you have this rise of anarchism and also race riots that are happening with African-American migration internally. There's a feeling that there's been too much upheaval, and Warren G. Harding wants to bring us back to the simple values of the Gilded Age. This return to normalcy, then, is going to bring an end to our progressive era, and we're about to have three presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, who are about to bring us in a very conservative direction. And in that direction, they're very much going to be an inspiration to modern-day Republicans, especially for Ronald Reagan, who will see Calvin Coolidge as being one of his personal heroes. We're going to find also that with America's behavior, we're going to see that America steps away at a moment when their leadership was essentially needed. And that's failure to step up at that moment in a foreign policy way is going to create a vacuum. And we're going to see over the next couple decades the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, Joseph Stalin in Russia, Emperor Hirohito in Japan. And all of that's going to take place while America tries to insulate itself inside of its country that's surrounded by two oceans and neighbors that are not strong enough to be able to threaten them. We're about to enter an era, though, where other countries are going to build themselves up so much technologically that they can still reach the United States, even if the United States is being isolationist. For the United States, then, this is where we're going to see ourselves going, a return to normalcy with domestic policy and isolationism with foreign policy, and that's how we wrap up Chapter 29. Again, if you have questions, we'll be reviewing on Sunday before the Super Bowl gets started, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I'll be happy to help out.